Before we begin, take a deep breath. Let the day melt away as we step into the hushed, golden corridors of 18th century Versailles. Here, beneath the glow of candlelit chandeliers and the rustle of silks, a marriage was arranged not out of love, but necessity. The world was watching when a teenage Austrian archduchess crossed borders to become the bride of a future king. But this union, designed to heal diplomatic rifts, would quietly fester into one of the most catastrophic royal partnerships in history. Tonight, we explore the marriage of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the romance that failed an empire. Marie Antoinette was born in 1755, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. Her early years were steeped in music, etiquette, and political grooming. She was not, however, educated deeply in matters of state. At just 14 years old, she was betrothed to Louis Auguste, the Dauphin of France, a quiet and awkward 15-year-old boy with little interest in people, and even less in politics. Their marriage was not about affection. It was a chess move. Austria and France had long been enemies, and this alliance was crafted to keep their ambitions aligned, at least diplomatically. From the start, their relationship was strained. Louis was painfully shy and socially withdrawn, far more interested in hunting and lockmaking than in courting his wife. Marie, on the other hand, was outgoing, spirited, and unprepared for the severe formality of the French court. Their personalities clashed in silence. The young queen-to-be found solace in parties, gambling, and fashion, anything to distract her from her husband's emotional distance. As months turned into years, their marriage remained unconsummated, which raised concerns and rumors in both courts. Whispers of dysfunction spread through Versailles like perfume on silk. The delay in producing an heir caused tension, not only between the couple, but across the continent. In an era where royal women were judged almost solely by their ability to bear children, Marie's failure to do so became a source of gossip and scorn. Meanwhile, pamphleteers and satirists accused her of coldness, foreign corruption, and even sexual deviance. The French public, suffering under heavy taxation and rising bread prices, began to see their queen not as a unifying figure, but as an indulgent outsider, an Austrian interloper who squandered their resources while they starved. Marie, barely out of adolescence, became a scapegoat for all the grievances of a troubled nation. Versailles, already a powder keg of politics and jealousy, became a hostile environment for the foreign queen. Court factions maneuvered around her, and every dress, every dance, every party became ammunition against her. Her extravagant lifestyle, which was not significantly more excessive than previous queens, was portrayed as outrageous in a time of national hardship. Her infamous Hamlet, a mock peasant village where she pretended to live a simpler life, was seen as a grotesque mockery of the very people she ruled. Louis, meanwhile, did little to shield her. As king, he was indecisive and heavily influenced by his advisors. He struggled to assert authority and lacked the charisma to inspire confidence. Though he eventually consummated the marriage and fathered 4 children with Marie, their personal bond never grew strong. They remained distant partners, bound by duty, isolated by fear. As revolutionaries sharpened their rhetoric and plotted the downfall of the monarchy, the royal couple seemed to retreat further into the palace walls. They were monarchs drifting on a tide of change they neither controlled nor understood. The situation worsened with France's financial collapse. Years of war, including heavy involvement in the American Revolution, had left the kingdom bankrupt. Tax reform was needed, but the nobility resisted. When Louis finally summoned the Estates General in 1789, the first time in over 175 years, it opened the door for dramatic political upheaval. Marie, already unpopular, was portrayed as an obstacle to reform. Her every move was seen through a lens of suspicion. Revolutionaries painted her as a meddler, a traitor, and a lover of luxury. Her enemies called her Madame Deficit, holding her responsible for France's economic ruin. In truth, Marie Antoinette was largely out of her depth. She was not politically savvy and lacked the support she needed to defend herself in court or in public. Despite attempts to reform her image, caring for the poor, reducing expenses, it was too late. The tide of revolution was rising. When the Bastille fell in July 1789, it marked the beginning of the end for the royal family. Within months, their power was all but symbolic. Forced from Versailles and moved to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, the king and queen became prisoners in all but name. Their attempted escape in 1791 sealed their fate. Disguised as commoners, the royal family fled toward the Austrian border but were captured in Varennes and returned to Paris under heavy guard. The incident shattered any remaining illusion that the king could lead his people. Trust was broken. The couple was now openly despised. France was no longer a monarchy in spirit. Louis and Marie were figureheads in a system collapsing around them. Political clubs like the Jacobins called for their trial and execution. The people, hungry for justice and blinded by rage, wanted blood. In 1792, the monarchy was formally abolished, and France became a republic. Louis was tried and found guilty of treason. His execution in January 1793 was a solemn, tragic affair. He mounted the scaffold with dignity, addressing the crowd before the guillotine fell. Marie, now widowed, was kept in harsh imprisonment. Her hair turned white, and her body weakened from stress and neglect. In October of that year, she too was brought to trial. Her reputation already destroyed, her defense meaningless. Accused of incest, treason, and conspiracy, she met her fate without fanfare, carted through Paris in a wooden tumbril. As she ascended the scaffold, Marie Antoinette reportedly apologized to the executioner for stepping on his foot. Her death marked the end of a tragic arc, from hopeful bride to vilified queen to fallen monarch. Her life, entangled with extravagance, misunderstanding, and political turmoil, became a cautionary tale. The marriage that was meant to unify Austria and France instead accelerated their divergence. In the end, Louis and Marie were victims not just of public hatred, but of a rigid system unable to adapt. Their union, so full of potential, became a royal catastrophe of historical proportions. What makes this marriage particularly disastrous is not the infidelity, scandal, or personal betrayal found in other royal unions, but the sheer scale of its consequences. Their misaligned personalities, compounded by inexperience and political ignorance, turned a royal alliance into a slow-motion disaster. Their inability to navigate public sentiment or wield effective power led to the collapse of the French monarchy and the rise of revolutionary violence. In trying to uphold tradition, they were swept away by progress. And in their failure to connect, not only with each other, but with their people, they became martyrs to a crumbling world order. Even today, the names Louis and Marie evoke images of decadence and downfall. But the truth is more tragic than theatrical. They were young, isolated and unprepared. Marie never chose France. Louis never chose to be king in revolutionary times. Together, they were cast in roles far beyond their depth, their fates sealed by circumstances and expectations they never truly understood. History remembers their marriage as disastrous, not just because it ended in death, but because it hastened the end of everything they were born to uphold. A crown, a country, a culture lost to the turning of the age. Their children were not spared the weight of this legacy. Their son, Louis Charles, was imprisoned and died in captivity at the age of 10. Only one daughter, Marie Therese, survived the revolution and lived a quiet life in exile. The family line, once destined to rule Europe, was shattered. Versailles, once their playground, stood empty. Portraits were defaced, monuments destroyed. The world moved on without them, and yet their story lingered like perfume in an abandoned ballroom, elegant, fading, and full of ghosts. The echoes of their failures still whisper through the pages of history, quietly reminding us of how power, when misused or misunderstood, can collapse from within. As you close your eyes and let the quiet settle in, imagine the stillness of the palace after the revolution. Empty halls, silent gardens, the clink of crystal replaced by the hush of dust. The marriage of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette began with promise and ended in ruin, not just for them, but for an entire way of life. Their story is not one of villainy or virtue, but of quiet tragedy. And now, we let that story drift away like a paper fan dropped from a royal hand. Let it settle beside your thoughts as we journey next to another royal disaster. Close your eyes and picture the crimson and gold splendor of Tudor England. Hear the solemn toll of cathedral bells, the whisper of silk gowns brushing across stone floors, and the low hum of court intrigue beneath every royal decree. In this chapter of royal catastrophe, we explore the turbulent, magnetic, and ultimately tragic marriage between England's most notorious king, Henry VIII, and the woman for whom he defied the Pope, Anne Boleyn. Their story began with flirtation and fire, but ended with betrayal, blood, and the sound of a blade slicing through morning mist. It was love turned lethal and legacy forever changed. Henry VIII was not a king used to hearing the word no. Athletic, powerful, and deeply convinced of his divine right to rule, he expected loyalty, devotion, and heirs, preferably male. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had given him a daughter, Mary, but failed to deliver a son. As Henry's impatience grew, so did his attention to a lady of the court, Anne Boleyn. Unlike many, and refused to become his mistress. She was clever, educated, and ambitious, using rejection as a tool to draw him in. She didn't give herself to him. She made him chase her. Their courtship was intense, laced with letters, promises, and political landmines. And to marry Henry, he needed to annul his marriage to Catherine, a deeply unpopular decision, both with the Catholic Church and with the English people. But Henry was relentless. When the Pope refused, he took matters into his own hands. In 1533, Henry broke from Rome, declared himself head of the Church of England, and wed Anne in a secret ceremony. Soon after, Anne was crowned queen. It was a bold, history-altering act, but what had begun in fiery defiance would quickly turn to ash. The English Reformation that followed tore the nation in two. Monasteries were dissolved, church lands seized, and loyal Catholics persecuted. Meanwhile, and was thrust into a role she was never quite prepared for. Though she had outwitted Catherine politically and was not universally adored, she was often portrayed as cold, sharp-tongued, and calculating, where Catherine had been viewed as noble and patient, and was seen as a seductress and usurper. Even worse, when she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, rather than a long-awaited son, her standing at court began to crumble, just as Catherine's had. Henry, once obsessed, began to drift. His attentions wandered to other women, and his frustration with his inability to produce a male heir grew. The charm that had once fascinated him now grated on his nerves. At court, and faced enemies who had bided their time, courtiers and nobles who favored a return to Catholicism or simply resented a rise to power. Behind smiles and bows, daggers were being drawn, and sharp wit and reformist leanings only fueled resentment. She was politically active, speaking out on religious policy, which was considered dangerous territory for a queen in that era. By 1536, Anne's enemies were closing in. A series of miscarriages had devastated her. Rumors swirled about her failing marriage. When she miscarried a male child after a public argument with Henry, many saw it as the final straw. Soon after, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, many of them baseless, fabricated, or wildly exaggerated. It was said she had seduced multiple men at court, including her own brother, George Boleyn. Whether Henry believed these accusations or merely needed a clean exit is still debated, but the verdict was swift and brutal, and was tried in the Tower of London, where a court of her enemies sealed her fate. Though she defended herself eloquently, the outcome had already been decided. Henry, by then enamored with Jane Seymour, needed and out of the picture on May 19th, 1536, and was executed by a skilled French swordsman. She met her end with grace, reportedly praying for Henry's well-being. Her death marked the beginning of a dark pattern. Henry would go on to marry 4 more women, 2 of whom would also face the axe. But Anne's fall was uniquely tragic. What made their marriage so disastrous wasn't just how it ended, but the way it reshaped England forever. Henry's pursuit of and didn't just break a marriage, it broke an entire religious structure. The creation of the Church of England, sparked by desire and sustained by politics, led to centuries of conflict. Civil wars, persecutions, and power struggles stemmed from that one royal union. And yet, from the wreckage, something remarkable emerged. The daughter Henry once dismissed, Elizabeth I, would go on to become one of the greatest monarchs in British history, outshining both her mother and father. Anne's legacy is a complicated one. She was a woman of ambition, intellect, and political insight, qualities both admired and punished at her time. Her rise to power was meteoric, and her fall just as swift. She dared to challenge the traditions of courtly submission, to speak her mind, and to reshape the religious landscape alongside Henry. And for that, she paid with her life. Even centuries later, historians debate whether she was a scheming temptress or a misunderstood reformer. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in the quiet space between the myth and the memory. Henry, for his part, never truly recovered from the upheaval Anne's reign had caused. His remaining marriages were increasingly desperate, each one haunted by his obsession with securing a male heir. His reign became defined by paranoia, cruelty, and physical decline. The young, charismatic king who had once jousted in golden armor became a bloated tyrant, feared more than loved. His personal life, once the domain of romantic letters and secret vows, became a horror show of executions, annulments, and bitter disappointments. And it all began with the passion that drew him to Anne. As you rest your eyes and let your thoughts drift, imagine the echoes of Anne's footsteps in the tower, the cold wind whipping through the courtyard, and the soft rustle of a queen's final prayer. Her story reminds us that love, when mixed with power, can become a dangerous potion, and that in royal courts, affection is never just personal. It's political, perilous, and often fatal. The marriage of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn stands as one of the most unforgettable calamities in monarchy, a blend of seduction, revolution, and silent betrayal. The Tower of London still stands, its walls silent witnesses to Anne's final days. Tourists pass through the courtyard where the scaffold once stood, unaware that beneath the cobblestones lie the ghosts of royal ambition. It's hard not to wonder what Anne thought in those final hours. Did she regret reaching for power? Or did she accept her fate as the price of playing the dangerous game of monarchy? Her daughter's future reign would be her truest legacy, a poetic twist given that Henry's beloved son Edward would die young, and Elizabeth would reign for 45 years. The tale of Henry and is not just history. It's a cautionary lullaby. It lulls us with grandeur, then jolts us with cruelty. It's a reminder that the higher the throne, the sharper the fall. Theirs was a love that burned too brightly, consuming everything in its path. And as the embers cooled, all that remained was a kingdom forever changed. So as you lie in stillness tonight, let their story become a quiet echo, fading gently into sleep, two voices long gone, but still whispering from the pages of time. Now, as we step away from the fiery halls of Tudor England, we prepare to journey toward another royal disaster, one written not in the blood of queens, but in the suffocating silence of a royal cage. Join me next as we enter the icy world of Russian imperial marriage, where titles meant isolation and love meant very little at all. But for now, rest your thoughts with Anne's final words. To Jesus Christ, I commend my soul. Lord, have mercy on me. A whisper lost to the wind, in a kingdom built on broken vows. In the frostbitten heart of imperial Russia, behind the gilded gates of palaces glittering with Faberge eggs and flickering candlelight, a royal marriage bloomed not from politics or diplomacy, but from genuine love. And yet, that love would become a dangerous weakness. The union of Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra Fedorovna stands as one of history's most haunting royal marriages, bound by deep affection, yet marked by fatal misjudgments. Their unwavering devotion to each other blinded them to the tides of change. Tonight, let your breath slow as we drift into the tragic romance that helped bring down the Romanov dynasty. Nicholas II never expected to become Tsar. His father, Alexander III, ruled with an iron will and kept his son away from affairs of state. When Nicholas ascended to the throne in 1894, he was woefully unprepared. Shy, deeply religious, and conservative, Nicholas believed in autocracy, the divine right to rule without interference. But the world around him was evolving rapidly. Revolutionary ideas stirred in the cities, and Russia's growing middle class demanded reform. At the heart of his reign stood his wife, Alexandra, a German-born princess whose intense devotion would shape and ultimately destabilize his reign in ways he could never foresee. Alexandra, born Alex of Hesse, was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Raised in a strict and pious environment of a German court, she converted to Russian Orthodoxy before marrying Nicholas, taking the name Alexandra Fyodorovna. Her love for Nicholas was total, bordering on obsession. She encouraged his belief in divine right and reinforced his resistance to political change. Though her intentions were sincere, her effect was isolating. The Russian public never embraced her. She was shy, spoke Russian poorly, and was considered cold and aloof. Her foreign origin made her the subject of suspicion, especially during times of political unrest. The couple's early years were filled with hope. They had 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. But it was the birth of their only son, Alexei, that brought both joy and despair. The heir to the Russian throne was born with hemophilia, a life-threatening blood disorder. At the time, there was no cure, and the disease was kept secret. Alexandra was devastated. She saw her son's suffering as a divine test, and her desperation to save him drove her into the arms of a mysterious Siberian peasant and self-proclaimed holy man, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin's arrival at court was both miraculous and disastrous. He seemed to ease Alexei's pain through prayer and hypnosis, gaining Alexandra's absolute trust. She believed he was sent by God to protect the Romanovs. But to the Russian public and nobility, Rasputin was a scandalous figure, lecherous, unkempt, and dangerously influential. His presence fueled rumors of corruption and moral decay within the palace. As Nicholas withdrew from political affairs and left decisions increasingly to Alexandra, who in turn relied on Rasputin, the empire began to spiral. The government weakened. Ministers were dismissed at Rasputin's whim. Public confidence eroded. Nicholas's leadership during World War I only worsened matters. In 1915, he took personal command of the Russian army, leaving Alexandra in charge of domestic governance. She, in turn, leaned on Rasputin more than ever. The war was a disaster. Millions died, resources vanished, and morale collapsed. The people blamed the imperial family for every hardship. Red lines turned to protests. Soldiers mutinied, and all the while, the royal couple clung to each other, unable or unwilling to see the storm gathering around them. Their love had become a bubble, floating above the unrest, impervious to the cries from below. In 1916, Rasputin was assassinated by nobles desperate to save the monarchy. But it was too late. The damage was done. In March 1917, Nicholas was forced to abdicate. The Romanov dynasty had ruled Russia for over 300 years. But in the span of a few weeks, it all crumbled. Nicholas, Alexandra, and her children were placed under house arrest. Their world, once filled with state banquets, diamond tiaras, and royal decrees, was now reduced to silent rooms under constant surveillance. Still, Nicholas and Alexandra remained devoted to one another, their love a small ember in the cold gloom of revolution. During their captivity, the family found brief moments of peace. They read, prayed, and stayed close. Nicholas chopped firewood. Alexandra, now in failing health, wrote letters and cared for her children. Despite their fall from power, they remained bound together by an almost unshakable sense of duty and divine purpose. But outside their prison walls, Russia descended into chaos. The Bolsheviks seized control. Civil war erupted. The Romanovs became a liability, symbols of the old world that the new regime wanted erased. Their fate was quietly decided in a secret chamber in a house far from St. Petersburg. On the night of July 16th, 1918, the entire family was led into a basement under the pretense of being moved for their safety. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 loyal servants stood in the cramped room, confused and weary. Without warning, gunmen entered and opened fire. The execution was brutal and chaotic. The daughters, wearing corsets sewn with jewels, did not die instantly. It took multiple rounds and bayonets to end their lives. In that dark cellar in Ekaterinburg, the final chapter of Nicholas and Alexandra's love story was written in blood. Their deaths shocked the world. News of the execution spread slowly, and details remained unclear for decades. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized them as martyrs, and over time, their story took on a mythic quality. Nicholas and Alexandra were not perfect rulers. In fact, their reign was riddled with missteps and tragic consequences, but they were devoted parents, lovers, and human beings caught in the whirlwind of a world that no longer wanted monarchs. Their downfall was not just political, it was deeply personal. A family destroyed by the very loyalty and love they believed would protect them. Theirs was a disastrous marriage not because of infidelity, scandal, or personal cruelty, but because of misplaced trust, willful blindness, and isolation. Alexandra's faith in Rasputin, Nicholas's refusal to modernize, and their shared conviction in divine right created a bubble that could not withstand the pressure of revolution. Their love, sincere and rare in royal circles, was ultimately not enough to save them. And so, what began as a heartfelt union became a tragic symbol of an empire's collapse. In their downfall, they took centuries of monarchy with them, leaving behind only silence, mystery, and shattered portraits. The Romanov children, especially Anastasia, became figures of legend. Rumors swirled that she had survived the massacre. Imposters claimed her identity. Books, films, and folktales kept the family alive in public imagination. But forensic evidence eventually confirmed the grim truth. The entire family perished that night. Their bones, buried in shallow graves, were exhumed decades later and laid to rest with full honors. The love story of Nicholas and Alexandra lives on not in palaces or monuments, but in the quiet testimonies of letters, diaries, and fading photographs, where their eyes still hold the weight of hope and sorrow. Imagine now the winter winds curling around the silent walls of the Alexander Palace. The laughter of children once echoed through those halls, now replaced by the hush of memory. Nicholas and Alexandra's marriage was a love story caught in the jaws of history. They were two people clinging to each other while the world fell apart. And though their choices helped accelerate that collapse, their devotion remained constant to the very end. As you drift deeper into sleep, let their tale linger gently, reminding us that even the grandest thrones rest on fragile foundations of faith, fear, and flawed humanity. The Romanovs remind us that love in the corridors of power is rarely enough. In the end, history is not only shaped by policies or armies, but by the people behind the crowns, their fears, desires, and decisions. Nicholas and Alexandra ruled during one of the most pivotal moments in modern history, yet they remained tragically unaware of how deeply the world had changed. Their marriage, tender but disconnected from reality, became a symbol of imperial failure. And in their final moments, they were no longer Tsar and Tsarina, just a husband and wife, holding hands in the darkness. As we close the curtain on this chapter of royal ruin, let your thoughts soften with the snow that falls eternally in Russian memory. The palaces are quiet now, the jewels gone, the voices stilled. Yet the tragedy of Nicholas and Alexandra lives on, not in grandeur, but in its quiet heartbreak. In the next segment, we'll journey west to yet another royal couple whose marriage was anything but romantic. One built on bitterness, betrayal, and banishment. But for now, rest in the hush of history, where love once ruled and silence remains. It began with a letter, one of hundreds Napoleon Bonaparte would write, filled with longing, jealousy, and obsession. Josephine de Beauharnais was not his first love, but she would be the one to haunt him the most. Their romance, turbulent and intense, unfolded during one of Europe's most explosive political eras. Born in revolution and crowned in imperial glory, their marriage seemed destined for greatness. Yet behind the public triumphs lay a story riddled with betrayal, insecurity, and emotional ruin. Tonight, let us drift gently into the world of Napoleon and Josephine, a love that burned brightly, but collapsed under the weight of empire. Josephine was born Marie Joseph Rose Tascher de la Pédrie in Martinique in 1763, a world away from French politics. She came to Paris as a teenager, married Alexander de Beauharnais, and had 2 children. But during the Reign of Terror, he was guillotined and Josephine was imprisoned. She barely escaped death. When she met Napoleon in 1795, she was 32 and a well-connected widow. He was 6 years younger, a rising military general, intense, awkward, and utterly besotted with her. Their courtship was fast, and within a year, they were married. But love was only the beginning. Napoleon idolized Josephine, calling her the only woman I have loved. His letters to her were feverish, dramatic, and full of aching desire. But Josephine was cool, independent, and unfaithful. While Napoleon was away leading military campaigns, she had affairs, most notably with Lieutenant Hippolyte Charles. Gossip swirled through salons and military tents alike. When Napoleon discovered her betrayal, he was devastated. His love for Josephine never fully recovered. Though he forgave her publicly, something within him had changed. Their marriage continued, but suspicion and bitterness began to poison the wellspring of their once vibrant connection. Despite their personal troubles, Josephine rose alongside Napoleon. When he crowned himself emperor in 1804, she became Empress of the French. But her position was always precarious. She had failed to provide Napoleon with an heir. Her 2 children were from her first marriage. The lack of a legitimate successor haunted Napoleon, whose ambitions stretched across continents. Court whispers turned into pressure from advisors. As much as Napoleon loved Josephine, he began to see her as a liability to the future of his dynasty. The stage was set for heartbreak, staged not in private, but under the weight of history. Josephine tried everything to hold on to her position. She consulted doctors, healers, even mystics in hopes of producing a child. But her age and past illness made it unlikely. Meanwhile, Napoleon's own affairs became more frequent. The passion between them flickered, but the strain of imperial demands left little space for repair. Josephine retreated into her gardens and her famously exquisite fashion, while Napoleon moved deeper into the mechanisms of power. In public, they remained regal, but behind the curtains, they drifted like ships no longer sailing in the same direction, tethered only by memory and formality. In 1809, after years of tension, Napoleon made the decision to divorce Josephine. It was not a spontaneous act, but a calculated sacrifice. He informed her with sorrow, and despite her devastation, Josephine agreed, out of duty, perhaps, or exhaustion. On December 15th of that year, the formal separation took place. The ceremony was deeply emotional. Both reportedly wept during the proceedings. Josephine read aloud a letter of resignation, while Napoleon kissed her hand and assured her of continued respect and honor. It was the end of an era, one marked not by warfare, but by the quiet ache of personal loss. After the divorce, Napoleon married Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, who bore him a son, Napoleon II. This political alliance was meant to secure his empire with legitimacy and lineage. Yet many noted that he never loved Marie-Louise the way he had loved Josephine. His letters became colder, his triumphs less joyful. Josephine, now living at Malmaison, retreated into a life of gardens, art, and hosting. Though no longer empress, she remained beloved by many. Dignitaries, artists, and old friends visited her often, finding in her a refined charm and quiet sorrow that lingered long after the crown was gone. Josephine never remarried. Though courted by princes and nobles, she remained emotionally tethered to Napoleon. He too could not forget her. Even during his military campaigns, he requested updates on her health, her habits, her moods. When they did meet in passing, their interactions were warm and respectful, haunted by a love they could not revive. Napoleon once reportedly told a confidant that he would rather have died than leave her. But duty had triumphed over affection, and now both lived apart, exiles of a love sacrificed to the altar of empire. In 1814, after Napoleon's abdication, Josephine received members of the Russian royal family at Malmaison. She was still seen as a symbol of French grace and beauty, but her health had begun to fail. Weakened by pneumonia and emotional strain, she died quietly in May of that year at the age of 50. Her last words were said to express concern over Napoleon's fate. When news of her death reached the exiled emperor on Elba, he was reportedly shattered. He wandered the grounds of his new, diminished life in silence, clutching the memory of the woman he had once loved beyond reason. In the end, Napoleon's marriage to Josephine was one of deep contradictions, filled with passion, betrayal, political compromise, and irrevocable love. It was a union that both elevated and tormented him. Her presence had given him credibility and sophistication. Her loss marked the beginning of his emotional decline. Though he remarried, produced an heir, and continued to fight across Europe, something essential had been lost with Josephine. In letters, in dreams, and even in death, she remained with him. His last words on his deathbed were said to include her name: France, the army, head of the army, Josephine. Their marriage was disastrous, not in the conventional sense of mutual hatred or public scandal, but because it demanded a choice between personal happiness and imperial ambition. Napoleon chose empire and lost both. Josephine, in turn, paid the price for a role she could not fully fulfill, though her charm and influence had shaped one of the most iconic eras in European history. They were two individuals bound by time, chance, and a love too fragile to carry the burden of a nation's future. Their story is a reminder that even emperors must answer to the laws of the heart. The legacy of Napoleon and Josephine can be found not just in books or statues, But in the rose gardens of Malmaison, where she once walked barefoot, preferring the scent of blossoms to the rigid formality of court, her taste, style, and sense of beauty influenced French culture for generations. Napoleon's military genius and tragic downfall became the stuff of legend. Yet, beneath the grandeur of campaigns and coronations, their story remains a deeply human one, a tale of longing, mistakes, and the weight of impossible choices. It is history not as epic, but as quietly heartbreaking. In the modern imagination, Josephine is often overshadowed by Napoleon's colossal shadow. But her story stands on its own, a woman of charm, resilience, and contradiction. She rose from imprisonment to empress, from scandal to sophistication. Her ability to navigate the shifting tides of revolutionary and imperial France speaks volumes. And though history has painted her as a socialite or a symbol, she was also a woman caught in the merciless machinery of dynastic expectation. Her only crime was being unable to bear a child, yet she bore the burdens of empire with remarkable grace. As for Napoleon, his tragedy was not just his exile or defeat at Waterloo, but the hollowing of his personal world. He had built an empire of stone, steel, and fire, but had destroyed the one person who might have tempered his ambition with warmth. Josephine had humanized him, grounded him, perhaps even loved him in a way that was inconvenient for a man chasing immortality. In the end, that chase left him alone on a wind-swept island, with memories and regrets as his only companions. For all his triumphs, he could not conquer the past. So now, as you close your eyes and let the echoes of empires fade, remember that behind every throne is a heart, flawed, yearning, and vulnerable. The story of Napoleon and Josephine is one of love stretched too thin, of power overpowering affection, and of time unraveling what seemed eternal. Their marriage was not just a personal collapse. It was a fracture felt through palaces and battlefields alike. In the soft hush of history, their voices linger, one calling out in a love letter, the other lost among roses and memory. Once upon a time, the world held its breath. Cameras flashed, choirs echoed, and millions tuned in to watch a young schoolteacher marry the heir to the British throne. Lady Diana Spencer and Prince Charles were hailed as the embodiment of a modern fairy tale. The elegant virgin bride and the dutiful prince, set to restore magic to the monarchy. But beneath the silk gown and royal fanfare, their union was quietly cracking. This was not a storybook romance. It was a slow, public unraveling. Tonight, we walk gently through the gilded halls and lonely corridors of one of the 20th century's most heartbreaking royal marriages. When Diana met Charles, she was just 16, and he was already in his late 20s. Their courtship began in earnest a few years later, carefully orchestrated and publicly paraded. Diana was deemed suitable, aristocratic, young, and shy. Everything the palace believed the public wanted in a future queen. But what they failed to consider was that Diana was not a pawn to be positioned. She was a person, vulnerable, emotional, and unprepared for what awaited her. As their engagement was announced in 1981, the press frenzy began, and Diana's face was suddenly everywhere, even as her voice went unheard. From a start, something was off. In an infamous interview shortly after their engagement, a reporter asked the couple if they were in love. Diana replied quickly, "Of course." Charles, pausing, added with an unsettling smile, "Whatever in love means." That phrase would echo through history, revealing far more than it concealed. Diana adored Charles, but he remained emotionally distant. His heart, many believed, had always belonged to Camilla Parker Bowles, a woman he had loved before, but was discouraged from marrying due to royal expectations. Their relationship, however, never truly ended, even as Charles placed a ring on Diana's finger. Their wedding on July 29th, 1981, was a spectacle unlike any before. Watched by over 750 million people worldwide, it seemed to fulfill every fantasy of royal grandeur. But behind the veil, Diana was already overwhelmed. She was only 20, thrust into a world of protocol, press, and palace pressure. Charles, already accustomed to royal life, offered little emotional support. Diana would later say she felt like a lamb being led to slaughter. Her honeymoon was filled with tears, arguments, and the looming presence of Camilla. What the world saw as a dream beginning was, in truth, a quiet descent. As Princess of Wales, Diana captured the world's attention. Her beauty, empathy, and natural charisma made her beloved globally. She brought warmth to the monarchy, visiting hospitals, hugging children with AIDS, and walking through landmine fields. But the very traits that endeared her to the public made her an outsider in the palace. She was more popular than Charles, and the royal household viewed her emotional openness as a liability. Behind closed doors, she struggled with intense loneliness, eating disorders, and depression. She had been handed a crown, but no guidance, a spotlight, but no safety. The birth of Prince William in 1982 brought momentary joy. Diana was a devoted mother and found comfort in her children. But even motherhood could not mend the cracks in her marriage. Charles, growing resentful of Diana's fame, sought solace in old habits, including his continuing relationship with Camilla. Diana knew, the palace knew, but nothing changed. By the time Prince Harry was born in 1984, the couple was merely going through the motions. Their public appearances became performances, marked by forced smiles and practiced handholding. The fairy tale was now a farce, carefully staged for cameras but hollow inside. Diana, feeling betrayed and emotionally abandoned, began to speak out in her own way. Her interviews, body language, and subtle comments hinted at her suffering. She reportedly recorded tapes detailing her bulimia, her suicide attempts, and her knowledge of Charles's infidelity. These tapes would later form the basis of books and documentaries that pulled the curtain back on palace life. In 1992, the separation became official, though they remained married for several more years. The media, sensing blood in the water, fed on every rumor, photo, and whisper. Diana was both hounded and adored, living in a fishbowl with no escape. As Charles and Diana drifted apart, their lives took separate paths. Charles resumed his relationship with Camilla more openly, while Diana began new relationships of her own. But no matter where she turned, the press followed. Every outing, every word, every gesture was dissected. The more she tried to reclaim her identity, the more the world pressed in. In her famous 1995 BBC interview, Diana laid it all bare. "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." With those words, the fairy tale ended, and the truth took its place, raw, painful, and undeniable. Their divorce was finalized in 1996. Diana lost her title of Her Royal Highness, but gained a newfound sense of freedom. She threw herself into charity work, becoming a global humanitarian icon. Yet peace was fleeting. In August 1997, just 1 year after her divorce, Diana was killed in a car crash in Paris while being chased by paparazzi. The world mourned. Flowers flooded the gates of Kensington Palace. Millions wept upon thee. Her death shocked the monarchy, which seemed initially cold in response, further fueling public grief and anger. Only days later did Queen Elizabeth address the nation directly. Charles, for his part, faced immense public criticism. His image, already bruised, suffered in comparison to the halo that encircled Diana after her death. Yet over time, a more nuanced picture emerged. Charles had been trapped by duty, torn between love and responsibility. Diana, meanwhile, was equally flawed, impulsive, emotionally wounded, and struggling to find her voice. Their marriage was not one of villains and saints, but of two people caught in a machine larger than either of them. A machine that devoured intimacy, distorted reality, and punished vulnerability. In the end, it broke them both in different ways. The tragedy of Charles and Diana's marriage lies in its avoidability. They were not compatible. They barely knew each other before marrying. Their union was arranged more for image than connection. Yet they were forced to perform a lifelong act for an audience that demanded perfection. And when they failed to meet expectations, the fallout was global. Diana's vulnerability was not a flaw. It was a mirror. People saw their own pain in her struggle. Charles, bound by centuries of royal expectation, was never able to be the man she needed. And in trying to serve two masters, love and duty, he served neither well. Today, their sons carry forward both the pain and promise of their parents' legacy. Prince William and Prince Harry have spoken openly about their mother, their mental health, and the emotional toll of growing up royal. Diana's influence is evident in their public work, their candor, and their relationships. Charles, now King Charles III, has finally married Camilla, who holds the title of Queen Consort. The past cannot be rewritten, but its impact continues to shape the present. Their story remains a lesson in what happens when humanity is forced into ritual and love is buried beneath duty. In retrospect, the marriage of Charles and Diana was never built to last. It was constructed on faulty foundations, societal pressure, public expectation, and emotional unavailability. Their personal struggles were magnified by the weight of the crown, the glare of the media, and the silence of the institution surrounding them. What might have been a quiet heartbreak became a global spectacle, consumed by millions, interpreted by tabloids, and mythologized by history. Yet at its core, it was a very simple tragedy. Two people bound together by tradition, but unable to find happiness within it. The world often remembers Diana in her moments of glamour, diamond tiaras, velvet gowns, flashing cameras. But it was her vulnerability, her emotional honesty, that left the most enduring mark. She shattered the image of the perfect princess and replaced it with something far more real. Charles, though less embraced, remains a reminder of the toll that royal expectation takes on personal freedom. Together, their marriage serves as both a cautionary tale and a chapter of modern history that still echoes through Buckingham Palace and beyond. A marriage that began with trumpets and carriages ended in silence, and the world is still listening. Now close your eyes and picture that grand cathedral, filled with flowers and promises. Hear the vows, the organs swell, the whispered prayers. And then let that vision fade. Let it dissolve into the quiet reality that followed. Long corridors, closed doors, aching hearts. The marriage of Charles and Diana reminds us that not all royal stories end with crowns and kisses. Some end with solitude, sacrifice, and the quiet dignity of surviving the storm. What remains are memories, some painful, some tender, all deeply human. And through those memories, their story continues to live on. If ever there was a royal marriage that played more like a farce than a fairy tale, it was that of George IV and Caroline of Brunswick. Their union was never rooted in affection, understanding, or even compatibility. It was a political arrangement born out of necessity and maintained through mutual disdain. From the very beginning, their marriage was doomed. He despised her. She mocked him. Theirs was a tale of two people legally bound but emotionally repelled, a relationship defined not by passion or tragedy, but by ridicule, court battles, and public spectacle. Their lives became a theater, and the curtain never truly closed. George IV, then Prince of Wales, had a long history of indulgence and irresponsibility. He had secretly married a Catholic widow, Maria Fitzherbert, in violation of the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which required the king's consent and forbade union with Catholics. That marriage was invalid by law, but emotionally very real to George. However, deeply in debt and pressured by his father, King George III, he agreed to marry a suitable Protestant princess. Caroline of Brunswick, a German noblewoman, was chosen. Their first meeting in 1795 was reportedly awkward and distasteful. George claimed she smelled and that he was repulsed. The wedding itself was a grim affair. George appeared drunk at the ceremony and, according to some accounts, passed out in the fireplace on his wedding night. Caroline, for her part, found him bloated, unpleasant, and excessively self-absorbed. Still, 9 months later, they produced one child, Princess Charlotte, who would become the center of royal hopes. But George and Caroline had already separated in everything but name. He moved to live apart from her almost immediately after the birth, resuming his affairs and lavishing attention on his inner circle. Caroline was left alone, humiliated, and increasingly rebellious. Caroline, despite her flaws, was quick-witted, strong-minded, and not one to suffer in silence. She began to defy royal protocol and speak her mind in public. She mingled with commoners, dressed flamboyantly, and made no secret of her contempt for George. The British public, who already saw George as a symbol of excess and moral decay, warmed to Caroline as a sort of rebellious underdog. While George immersed himself in extravagance, Caroline's brash honesty and disregard for court etiquette endeared her to many. A war of perception had begun, one that Caroline, for a time, was winning. George, meanwhile, tried everything to destroy Caroline's reputation. In 1806, he instigated the infamous Delicate investigation, an inquiry into rumors that Caroline had taken lovers and even given birth to an illegitimate child. The evidence was flimsy and the public was outraged. Caroline was ultimately cleared of wrongdoing, though the scandal lingered like smoke. It wasn't just about morality, it was about control. George wanted to erase Caroline from the narrative of monarchy, but she refused to be forgotten. With every attempt to disgrace her, public sympathy shifted further in her favor. Despite their shared royal status, Caroline and George never reconciled. She was effectively exiled from court, spending years traveling throughout Europe, often living in modest conditions. Her behavior could be erratic. She surrounded herself with questionable companions and courted scandal. But she remained a thorn in George's side. When George became king in 1820, Caroline returned to England, demanding recognition as queen. The government, under pressure from George, launched a formal trial, the Queen Caroline Affair, to strip her of her title. The proceedings were salacious and scandalous, exposing the dirty laundry of the monarchy to the public. The public rallied behind Caroline with an almost frenzied loyalty. Crowds followed her carriage, protests erupted, and political cartoons lampooned George as a decadent villain. Pamphlets and broadsides flooded the streets, portraying Caroline as a woman wronged. Parliament ultimately dropped the trial to avoid further unrest, but George still refused to allow her a role in his coronation. On July 19, 1821, the day of the lavish ceremony, Caroline arrived at Westminster Abbey, demanding entry. She was turned away at every door. Her exclusion was brutal, deliberate, and humiliating. Days later, her health began to rapidly deteriorate. Caroline died just a few weeks after the coronation on August 7, 1821. Her last words were said to be, "They used me barbarously." Whether those words were precisely recorded or not, the sentiment remains undeniable. Her body was escorted through London as per her wishes, with a sign on her coffin that read, "The injured Queen of England." Mourners lined the streets in the rain. Clashes broke out between the public and military. Even in death, Caroline unsettled the monarchy, reminding the people and the crown that she had not gone quietly. George IV went on to reign for another 9 years. He grew increasingly corpulent, reclusive, and unpopular. His lavish spending and aloofness from the public made him a target of satire. He had succeeded in removing Caroline from his life, but never from the public imagination. Her ghost lingered in public discourse, a symbol of royal cruelty and injustice. While George had power, Caroline had the people. And in a monarchy that depends on public affection as much as bloodlines, that distinction mattered. She had been exiled, mocked, and shamed, but never silenced. Their marriage was not tragic in the traditional sense. It was something altogether more absurd. George and Caroline's union was not marked by love lost or innocence betrayed, but by sheer incompatibility and vindictiveness. Their hatred was mutual and sustained. Yet it also exposed cracks in the foundation of the monarchy, cracks that showed just how far a crown could slip when pride and politics outpace empathy. If a royal marriage is meant to project stability, theirs did precisely the opposite. It revealed the emotional mess behind the embroidered curtains of palace life. It's easy to view Caroline as a martyr and George as a villain. But history often resists simplicity. Caroline was bold, charismatic, and deeply flawed. Her behavior was sometimes erratic and self-defeating. George, though selfish and cruel, was also trapped in a system that demanded appearances over honesty. Together, they personified the dysfunction of arranged royal marriages, alliances made not for affection, but for image. Theirs was not a love story. It was a cautionary tale, acted out in full view of an amused and horrified public, long before reality television ever existed. Caroline's legacy is complex. For some, she remains a feminist icon of resilience in the face of institutional misogyny. For others, she was simply a chaotic figure who poked at the fragile dignity of the crown. But one thing is certain: she refused to disappear. She refused to accept the silence and obedience expected of her. In doing so, she shifted the power dynamic, if only slightly, between monarchy and public. George, for all his pomp, never truly commanded the affection she did. Even as queen in name only, Caroline captured the soul of an empire tired of royal hypocrisy. Today, their story is less well known than others. There are no statues of Caroline in central London. No blockbuster films or sweeping novels romanticize their farcical union. Yet their marriage remains one of the clearest examples of royal dysfunction at its most theatrical. It was not just a personal disaster. It was a public spectacle that revealed the performative nature of monarchy itself. The forced smiles, the silken lies, the coronations and carriages, all masking a reality far messier and more human than the crown would like to admit. Let your eyes drift now to an image of George, garbed in velvet and jewels, a king adored by no one. Then to Caroline, standing defiantly at the abbey doors, locked out yet never forgotten. Between them lies a story not of love or loss, but of bitterness, pride, and performance. Their marriage was a battle, not a bond. And in the echoes of their cruelty, we find an uneasy reflection of power unchecked and humanity denied its place beneath the crown. When it comes to disastrous royal marriages, few monarchs can match the infamous record of England's Henry VIII. His 6 wives became legends in their own right. Some queens, some divorced, 2 executed. But among them, one marriage stands out not for its bloodshed or betrayal, but for its sheer awkwardness. The union between Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves was brief, humiliating, and almost farcical in its failure. And yet, unlike so many others entangled in Henry's affections, and emerged from the wreckage not in disgrace or danger, but with dignity, and perhaps even a touch of triumph. By the late 1530s, Henry VIII was in a difficult position. He had broken with the Catholic Church to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, had been executed. His third wife, Jane Seymour, had died shortly after giving birth to his only legitimate male heir, Edward. Now middle-aged, plagued by health issues, and politically isolated, Henry sought a new alliance, this time with the Protestant German states. A diplomatic marriage to Anne of Cleves, the sister of a powerful duke, seemed the perfect solution to secure Protestant support and balance against Catholic powers like France and Spain. Anne of Cleves was no court beauty. She had been raised in a conservative and modest court in the Duchy of Cleves, far from the opulence and political theater of Tudor England. She was educated, but had little experience in music, dance, or the social graces prized by Henry's court. Her portrait, painted by the renowned Hans Holbein the Younger, portrayed her as dignified, serene, and attractive, qualities that convinced Henry to proceed with the match. But portraits, like words, can lie, and no amount of paint could prepare either party for the meeting that followed. Henry, impulsive and theatrical, decided to surprise his bride. In late 1539, as he traveled to England, he disguised himself and entered her chambers unannounced to test her reaction, a romantic gesture he fancied from courtly tales. And, unfamiliar with this custom and unable to understand his behavior, responded with confusion and indifference. Henry was instantly displeased, his pride wounded. He found her unattractive and lacking the charm he had expected. "I like her not," he declared bitterly. But diplomacy and duty prevailed. The wedding moved forward, though Henry approached it with all the enthusiasm of a man walking to his own funeral. Their marriage, solemnized on January 6th, 1540, was awkward from the start. Henry was distant and was bewildered. They could barely communicate. She spoke little English, and he no German, on their wedding night. Henry later claimed he was so repulsed he could not consummate the union. He famously told his courtiers that she had evil smells and that her body lacked the softness he preferred. These crude and cruel remarks circulated widely, and, for her part, was unaware of the severity of Henry's disdain, at least initially. But the chill between them was undeniable. It didn't take long for Henry to seek a way out. He began confiding in his advisors that he had made a mistake, that the marriage was not valid due to his own unwillingness. Thomas Cromwell, who had brokered the alliance, began to fall from favor. Meanwhile, and was left in limbo, queen in name, but not in heart. She tried to please Henry, dressing according to English fashion, attending court functions, and showing deference. But her efforts were in vain. Henry's gaze had already shifted toward a young lady-in-waiting named Catherine Howard, whose youth and flirtation ignited his aging heart. In July 1540, just 6 months after the wedding, the marriage was annulled. The official grounds cited non-consummation and Anne's pre-contract to another nobleman, though neither carried much weight in truth. And, to her credit, did not resist. She agreed to the annulment with remarkable grace, stating that the marriage had never been completed and therefore was not binding. In return, Henry granted her a generous settlement, several estates, a large income, and the honorary title of the king's beloved sister. Unlike her predecessors, and would not be divorced with disgrace or executed in scandal, but rather retired with comfort and respect. What makes Anne of Cleves so fascinating in the long list of Henry's wives is her ability to adapt. She knew when to resist and when to yield. Her acquiescence was not submission, but strategy. By stepping back, she gained a peaceful life, material security, and independence, a rarity for any woman at court, let alone one who had briefly been queen. She remained in England, occasionally visiting court, and became close to Henry's children, particularly Mary and Elizabeth, while other wives were mired in political intrigue, and tended her gardens and enjoyed the freedom few Tudor women ever tasted. Cromwell, the man who arranged the marriage, was not so lucky. Once Henry soured on Anne, Cromwell's enemies seized their moment. He was arrested, charged with treason, and executed in July 1540, the very same month the marriage was annulled. The irony is sharp and survived by yielding, while Cromwell perished for orchestrating the match that failed. It was a brutal reminder that, in Tudor politics, favor was fleeting and loyalty rarely protected. Anne's quiet retreat contrasted sharply with the chaos that swirled around her departure, making her exit seem almost wise in its simplicity. Henry married Catherine Howard just weeks after his annulment with Anne. The contrast was stark. Catherine was young, vivacious, and flirtatious. Everything and was not. Yet her marriage, too, would end in disaster, culminating in her execution for adultery just 2 years later, as queens fell around her and remained untouched, watching from a safe distance. She lived through the rest of Henry's reign, through the brief rule of Edward VI, and into Mary I's time. Her ability to survive in a court so often fatal to women speaks volumes about her resilience and foresight. Anne's story is a quiet triumph in a sea of tragedies. She had no great love story, no passionate romance, and no political power. But she had survival. In an age when royal marriages were traps as often as they were thrones, and escaped with her head, her fortune, and her freedom. She made no enemies. She played no dangerous games. And in doing so, she became one of the few women to pass through Henry's life and emerge unbroken. Her tale is a rare one, not of downfall, but of escape. And that alone makes it extraordinary. Her life after marriage was largely peaceful. She lived in Richmond Palace and later Chelsea Manor, maintaining a household of her own. She remained a Protestant, avoided political entanglements, and was rarely drawn into court affairs. While she faded from the public eye, she never lost the favor of the crown. Even after Henry's death, she was treated with courtesy and allowed to retain her properties and income. She died in 1557 at the age of 41 and was buried at Westminster Abbey, the only one of Henry's wives to be buried in such a revered place without scandal or sorrow attached. And of Cleves may not have captured the drama or romance that history so often craves, but she offers something rarer, a portrait of quiet wisdom. She understood the limits of her situation and chose survival over confrontation. Her story reminds us that not all victories come from grand gestures. Sometimes, the greatest triumph is knowing when to walk away, when to bow without surrendering, and how to preserve one's dignity in the face of royal disappointment. In a gallery of doomed queens, it is the quiet figure in the corner, smiling gently, watching it all unfold, untouched by the chaos. When we think of disastrous royal marriages, we often imagine betrayal, heartbreak, and tragedy. Anne of Cleves gives us a different kind of failure, an awkward mismatch that, though brief, shaped lives and cost others their heads. Her marriage with Henry VIII was doomed from the start, a lesson in political haste and personal repulsion. But from its failure rose a figure of subtle strength. She was mocked by her husband, discarded by her court, and yet remembered with far more fondness than most who wore the crown. In history's long ledger of queens, Anne's entry is brief but quietly powerful. Let your thoughts settle on the quiet corridors of Chelsea Manor, the gentle rustle of linen, the muted laughter from distant chambers. And of Cleves, no longer a queen, no longer a political pawn, sits in the fading light with a book in her lap, her life her own at last. No king's desire, no nation's bargaining chip, just a woman who outlived the storm and smiled at its passing. Not every queen needs a crown to leave a mark, and not every failed marriage must end in ruin. Sometimes the exit is the triumph. Ludwig II of Bavaria is best remembered not for his politics, but for his castles, romantic, towering dreamscapes that seem pulled from the pages of myth. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, and Herrenchiemsee stand today as monuments to his imagination. But behind the fairy tale spires lay a monarch deeply troubled, withdrawn from the world, and overwhelmed by the duties of kingship. He lived more in Wagnerian opera than in his own court, lost in dreams and unreachable to those around him. And when it came to love, Ludwig's life was marked not by scandalous affairs or royal heirs, but by one broken engagement and a lifetime of longing. At the heart of Ludwig's only public romance was Duchess Sophie Charlotte in Bavaria. She was the youngest sister of Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as Sisi, and came from a respected and noble house. The match seemed ideal. Both were of royal blood, both steeped in the rituals of court, and both admired the arts. But Ludwig, by then in his early 20s, was already retreating from reality. His passion lay not in governance or matrimony, but in music, specifically the operas of Richard Wagner. He saw himself as a character from legend, destined to live in lofty solitude. The engagement between Ludwig and Sophie was announced in January 1867. On paper, it was perfect. Their families were close. Sophie was intelligent, charming, and politically suitable. The people of Bavaria rejoiced, hoping that marriage would stabilize their increasingly aloof king. But there were signs, even then, that something was wrong. Ludwig delayed the wedding multiple times. He became evasive, avoiding even private meetings with his fiancée. Letters from the time reveal his growing anxiety and emotional withdrawal. He told friends he admired Sophie, but did not love her. And more than that, he feared the intimacy marriage would demand. For Ludwig, love existed in abstraction. He idolized Wagner and his operatic characters, especially the tragic and pure-hearted heroes. His affections, according to historians, were directed more toward these fantasies than toward any living person. Some suggest that Ludwig was homosexual, though this remains debated. What is clear, however, is that he was profoundly uncomfortable with the physical and emotional realities of a romantic relationship. He saw Sophie as a friend, perhaps a muse, but not a partner. And the closer their wedding approached, the more the illusion began to crumble. He could not live the role he was expected to play. Sophie, for her part, remained patient. She adored Wagner's music and tried to engage with Ludwig through the art he loved. She wrote affectionate letters and expressed enthusiasm for their shared future. But as Ludwig pulled further away, she was left increasingly confused and humiliated. Court officials tried to pressure the king, but nothing moved him. He delayed, disappeared, and finally, in October 1867, just a few months before the scheduled wedding, he called the whole thing off. The engagement was officially annulled. Ludwig sent Sophie a letter thanking her for her kindness, then returned to his world of moonlit rides and silent corridors. The annulment was a blow to Sophie's reputation, though her family shielded her from the worst of the gossip. She would go on to marry Ferdinand Thurlens, Duke of Alausa, and live a quieter life. Though her end would come tragically, she perished in a fire at a Paris charity bazaar in 1897. As for Ludwig, he never married, never seriously courted another woman, and slowly disappeared into fantasy. He built castles that mimicked medieval grandeur, staged private performances of operas for himself alone, and communicated with courtiers only through written notes. Bavaria had a king in name, but not in presence. Ludwig's isolation deepened over the years. He filled his days with architecture, letters to Wagner, and long nocturnal carriage rides through the mountains. Ministers grew alarmed. He had bankrupted the royal treasury on his building projects and refused to engage in matters of state. Rumors spread about his mental health. By 1886, government officials declared him insane and deposed him in a carefully staged coup. Ludwig was arrested and confined to Berg Castle. Days later, under still mysterious circumstances, he was found dead in Lake Starnberg alongside his psychiatrist. Official reports claimed suicide, but speculation remains to this day. The story of Ludwig II and Sophie Charlotte is not a tale of mutual betrayal or fiery hatred. Instead, it is a story of incompatibility, a king who could not give what was required, and a woman who had hoped for more than a crown. Their failed engagement was not dramatic, but it was deeply telling. It revealed Ludwig's inability to live in the world expected of him, and it marked the beginning of his descent into isolation. His castles may dazzle the eye, but behind their glittering walls lies the melancholy of a man who could not bear reality. What makes their marriage that never was so disastrous is not its duration, but its symbolism. Ludwig's failure to marry Sophie was the moment his subjects truly realized their king had retreated for good. Bavaria needed a ruler, but it had inherited a dreamer, a man obsessed with myths, stories, and the unreachable purity of imagined love. Sophie, grounded and gracious, could have been a stabilizing force. But Ludwig didn't want stability. He wanted a life untouched by the weight of bodies and responsibilities. And in the end, the fantasy won. Sophie became just another figure in the gallery of lost possibilities. The cultural legacy of Ludwig II is paradoxical. He was seen as a failed monarch in his own lifetime, ineffectual, eccentric, and wasteful. Yet today, his castles are among Germany's greatest tourist attractions. Millions visit Neuschwanstein each year, unaware that the man behind its walls died in disgrace and confusion. Wagnerian music thunders through opera halls, while Ludwig's name evokes romanticism and mystery. And yet, for all his mythic associations, the truth remains haunting. He could not love in the way the world needed him to. He could only build monuments to love, never live it. Sophie Charlotte, by contrast, is remembered only faintly. Her legacy is not carved into stone, but exists in letters, footnotes, and the occasional portrait. She is a symbol of many royal women, caught between dynastic ambition and personal heartbreak. Her engagement to Ludwig was never consummated, never celebrated, and yet it changed both their lives irrevocably. She was the last woman who might have shared his world, however imperfectly. After her, Ludwig turned fully inward, and while she moved on, married, and bore children, he stood forever alone on a balcony, gazing at a world that no longer made sense to him. Their failed union speaks to the broader tragedy of royalty, the expectation that people will conform to roles that deny their nature. Ludwig was crowned, adored, and obligated, but he could not be the king they wanted. Sophie was poised, intelligent, and ready, but she was engaged to a man who loved shadows more than sunlight. In the end, both were casualties of a system that prized appearances over authenticity. Their story is not loud, but it is quietly devastating. A misconnection turned into national myth, a personal failure writ large on the stage of history. The lonely towers of Neuschwanstein still rise above the Bavarian hills, pristine and frozen in time. Visitors marvel at their beauty, often unaware of the sorrow that shaped them. Sophie's name is not engraved in their halls, but her absence echoes there, an eternal reminder of what was expected, what was lost, and what was simply never meant to be. Ludwig built his dream, but the foundation cracked long before the final stone was laid. And somewhere between the turrets and the twilight, a promise broke without ever having been spoken aloud. Few royal marriages have led to a coup, an empire's transformation, and the rise of one of history's most powerful female rulers. Yet that is exactly what happened with the union of Tsar Peter III and Catherine II of Russia, better known as Catherine the Great. Their marriage was anything but great. It was a union marked by contempt, coldness, and growing resentment. From its inception, it was a relationship devoid of love and filled with suspicion. And it would ultimately end not with a quiet separation, but with revolution, one that would change the fate of an empire forever. Peter III was born into royalty, but carried little of the presence or intellect expected of a future emperor. Awkward, impulsive, and deeply enamored with Prussian military culture, Peter was more interested in toy soldiers and German court traditions than in ruling vast Russia. He was the grandson of Peter the Great, but lacked his namesake's vision or charisma. Catherine, born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, was brought from Prussia to marry him. At just 14 years old, she was chosen by Empress Elizabeth, Peter's aunt, and was swiftly groomed to become a Russian consort. She changed her name, religion, and identity to fit the role. From the start, their relationship was cold. Peter reportedly mocked Catherine, humiliated her publicly, and showed little interest in her as a person or partner. He preferred the company of courtiers who flattered his childish obsessions and mistresses who tolerated his erratic behavior. Catherine, meanwhile, was bright, politically curious, and deeply ambitious. She immersed herself in Russian culture, read voraciously, and formed alliances within the court. She saw in Russia not just a home, but a destiny. Her marriage may have been loveless, but it gave her proximity to power, and Catherine understood the power of proximity better than most. Years passed without affection. The couple lived largely separate lives. Rumors circulated that their son, the future Paul I, may not have been Peter's child at all, but rather the result of one of Catherine's alleged affairs. Still, Catherine played her role dutifully in public. She studied governance, observed court dynamics, and waited. When Empress Elizabeth died in 1762, Peter ascended the throne. But his reign was short-lived and spectacularly clumsy. He immediately alienated the Russian nobility by withdrawing from war with Prussia and aligning closely with Frederick the Great, who was deeply unpopular among Russians. Peter's domestic policies were equally confusing. He offended the Orthodox Church, insulted his military leaders, and dismissed long-serving advisors. Catherine, observing it all, saw an opportunity. Peter's unpopularity was rapidly growing, and she had quietly secured the loyalty of the military, particularly the powerful Imperial Guard. When Peter attempted to arrest her and strip her of power, she moved quickly. In July 1762, just 6 months after Peter became Tsar, Catherine orchestrated a coup. Backed by the military and key political players, she seized control, declared herself empress, and forced Peter to abdicate. He was arrested and taken to a remote location. What followed was murky and tragic. Just 8 days after his abdication, Peter III died under mysterious circumstances while in captivity. The official report cited an acute hemorrhoidal colic, but few believe that. Most historians agree he was likely murdered, possibly with Catherine's knowledge or tacit approval. His death was never publicly investigated. It was quietly buried, both literally and politically. Catherine, meanwhile, ascended the throne with broad support and immediately began her long and transformative reign. Her marriage, once a trap, had become a stepping stone, and its violent end cleared the way for her to rule unchallenged. That Catherine's rule lasted over 3 decades. She expanded Russia's borders, modernized its administration, and promoted Enlightenment ideals, at least in principle. Her correspondence with European intellectuals like Voltaire and Diderot revealed a ruler deeply engaged in philosophy and reform. Yet she was also pragmatic and ruthless, suppressing uprisings and consolidating autocratic power. The irony of her reign was profound. A German-born princess who came to power through a coup became the very embodiment of Russian imperial strength. Her marriage to Peter III, disastrous as it was, had paved the way for one of the most impactful reigns in Russian history. Peter III's legacy, on the other hand, was largely erased. For decades, He was remembered as a weak, foolish ruler who squandered his chance to lead. His brief rule was mocked and dismissed. Only later, under his son Paul I, did efforts begin to rehabilitate his image. Paul, who deeply resented his mother for sidelining him and likely killing his father, built a monument to Peter and tried to elevate his reputation. But the damage had been done. Peter's reign was a historical footnote, overshadowed entirely by the woman he had once ridiculed and underestimated. The marriage of Peter and Catherine is a stark reminder of how dynastic unions could carry enormous political consequences. What began as a traditional match, an arranged union to strengthen empires, ended in betrayal, rebellion, and a transfer of power that would echo for generations. Their personal incompatibility was matched by divergent visions for Russia. Peter wanted to remake it in Prussia's image. Catherine saw the need to embrace Russian identity while selectively borrowing from European models. Their conflict was not just emotional, it was ideological. And in the end, only one vision could survive. Catherine's genius was her ability to cloak ambition in charm. She never openly denounced Peter before his fall, never staged loud public grievances. She worked in whispers, letters, and quiet meetings with generals and courtiers. She waited until the court and the country were ready to abandon him. And when they were, she acted with precision. In doing so, she not only ended a marriage, she redefined what it meant to be a woman in power. She was no consort, no regent, no mother of kings. She was empress of all the Russias. Alone, absolute, unquestioned. Though her personal life after Peter was filled with numerous lovers and companions, Catherine never remarried. Perhaps she had learned that marriage, for women like her, was a liability, not a blessing. Her lovers were influential, certainly, but never held official power. They were there for companionship, advice, and often pleasure, but never control. In contrast to her first and only marriage, Catherine chose to retain all political authority for herself. Her relationship with Peter had taught her that sharing a throne meant risking it, and she would never risk it again. Their story is not romantic, nor is it simply tragic. It is complex, an entanglement of duty, disappointment, and the brutal calculus of power. Catherine survived because she was smarter, shrewder, and far more in tune with the pulse of Russia than her husband ever was. Peter, the grandson of Peter the Great, failed to live up to his heritage. Catherine, a foreigner with no claim of blood, outshone him entirely. The marriage may have lasted nearly 2 decades, but its emotional connection was threadbare from start. They were monarchs by title, but only one ever truly ruled. Let your thoughts wander now to the echoing chambers of the Winter Palace, where Catherine once walked in silence, planning her moment. Imagine the candlelight flickering on her writing desk, letters half-written, sealed with wax, passed hand to hand through the cold corridors of intrigue. Peter sleeps soundly in a distant room, unaware that his reign is already slipping away. In those quiet hours before the soldiers arrive, history tilts, not with a bang, but a whisper, and the marriage, once forged in duty, ends in silence, shadow, and the dawn of a new empress rising alone. When Charles VI of France married Isabeau of Bavaria in 1385, hope flickered across the war-worn landscape of France. At only 15, Charles was young but optimistic, energetic, and popular. His bride, Isabeau, was equally young, chosen more for diplomacy and appearance than for any shared ideals or values. She arrived from a German court polished and pliable, expected to bear children and support the king. But the marriage, formed in the glow of pageantry and promise, would eventually collapse beneath the weight of mental illness, war, and manipulation. It wasn't simply a failed relationship. It was a disaster that helped tear a kingdom apart. Charles VI, who would come to be known as Charles the Mad, began his reign with promise. He was handsome, intelligent, and widely admired by the nobility and people alike. But by the age of 24, his mental health began to unravel. In 1392, he suffered his first psychotic break, attacking his own men in the forest of Le Mans, convinced they were enemies. From that moment on, his episodes became more frequent and disturbing. He would forget who he was, fail to recognize his wife and children, and go into fits of wild violence or detached stupor for weeks, sometimes months at a time. For Isabeau, the situation was harrowing. She had entered into a marriage expecting typical challenges of a medieval queen: childbearing, diplomacy, court etiquette, but instead found herself navigating the erratic behavior of a husband slipping further into madness. Despite bearing him 12 children, her influence at court was repeatedly questioned. Her political power ebbed and flowed, depending on Charles's mental state. When he was lucid, he ruled. When he was not, chaos reigned. The question of who should govern in his place became a brutal game of political tug-of-war, one in which Isabeau, often unwillingly, found herself at the center. During Charles's frequent periods of incapacity, the French court split into rival factions, each vying for control. The king's brother, Louis of Orleans, and the king's cousin, John the Fearless of Burgundy, led the opposing camps. Each saw Charles's condition as an opportunity to seize influence, and both used Isabeau's position to their advantage. She was portrayed alternately as a helpless pawn or a scheming queen, depending on the needs of their propaganda. In truth, she was caught in a dangerous web, pushed to maintain order while surrounded by men who viewed her as both a tool and a threat. Accusations against Isabeau grew more vicious over time. Political pamphlets accused her of adultery, greed, and manipulation. Rumors swirled that she had been the lover of Louis of Orleans. She was called a foreigner, a seductress, and a witch. Much of this was unfounded, stirred by those seeking to discredit her. But her power, real or imagined, made her target. As queen, she acted as regent during her husband's illness, signing treaties, making appointments, and protecting her children's interests. In a male-dominated world, that visibility invited attack. Every move she made was scrutinized and twisted into evidence of corruption or betrayal. One of the most devastating decisions made during her regency was the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. Under pressure from the English and from within her own divided court, Isabeau agreed to disinherit her son, the Dauphin Charles, and recognize Henry V of England as heir to the French throne. This act, while politically pragmatic under the circumstances, earned her eternal scorn from nationalists and future historians. She was painted as a traitor who sold France to the English. But in truth, she was trying to stabilize a kingdom that had been cracking under pressure for decades and had few choices left. The marriage between Charles and Isabeau, by its later years, had dissolved into symbolic formality. Charles's condition had rendered him incapable of real partnership. He reportedly believed he was made of glass, refused to be touched, and wandered the palace in rags. Isabeau, still queen by title, had become a political figure more than a wife. Her days were spent managing crisis after crisis. Invasions, betrayals, assassinations, and succession battles. The royal household, once filled with opulence, became a battlefield of whispers and alliances. And all the while, Charles drifted further from reality, the crown resting on a man who no longer knew what it meant. Isabeau's personal life, too, was marked by tragedy. Of her 12 children, many died young. The surviving sons became pawns in the civil war that tore France apart. The Dauphin Charles, disinherited by the Treaty of Troyes, eventually claimed the throne as Charles VII, but only after years of conflict and bitter estrangement from his mother. Their relationship was strained, shaped by mutual distrust and political necessity. In her later years, Isabeau was isolated, her former allies either dead or turned against her. Once a queen at the heart of Europe's most powerful court, she now lived in relative obscurity. Charles VI died in 1422, having spent the last 30 years of his life in and out of psychosis. Isabeau outlived him by 5 years, dying in 1435. By then, the monarchy had been weakened almost beyond recognition, its authority fractured by war, betrayal, and long years of instability. Their marriage, intended to cement alliances and bring strength to France, had instead presided over one of its darkest chapters. It was a union cursed not by infidelity or scandal alone, but by fate, illness, and a kingdom too vast for one troubled man to rule and one embattled woman to save. In retrospect, the marriage of Charles VI and Isabeau serves as a haunting lesson in the fragility of dynastic power. Even the strongest thrones rest on the health of those who occupy them. Charles's mental decline was not his fault, but it was catastrophic for France. Isabeau, often vilified, was trying to hold a disintegrating kingdom together with little guidance, little trust, and constant opposition. Theirs was not a marriage of betrayal, but of burden, one weighed down by forces they could not control. And while their love may never have blossomed, their story remains one of the most compelling in European history. The political vacuum left by Charles's madness allowed civil war to fester. France became a battlefield, not just between English and French forces, but among French nobles themselves. The Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War ravaged the land, tearing at its cultural and economic core. Amid this chaos, Isabeau became both symbol and scapegoat. She was blamed for the kingdom's failures, even though many of those failures were born from the chaos Charles's illness created. She tried to act, but every action only fed the fire. The very role that should have empowered her, queen consort and regent, became the position that ruined her. Despite everything, Isabeau was never exiled, never imprisoned, never executed. She maintained her dignity in public, even when private letters and poems vilified her. Her portraits, showing a composed, elegant woman in rich gowns, reveal none of the turmoil behind her eyes. History has not been kind to her, but modern scholarship has begun to reassess her legacy. She was not a perfect queen, but neither was she the villain early chroniclers made her out to be. She was navigating a system not made for women, especially not women trying to lead in a country at war with itself. In the long tapestry of royal marriages, Charles and Isabeau's union remains uniquely tragic. It was a marriage eroded not by scandal or neglect, but by illness and history's cruel timing. They were not enemies, nor particularly close companions. They were figures caught in a slow-motion collapse, each bearing the weight of a crown slipping from their grasp. Charles wandered palaces in confusion, while Isabeau sat in council chambers, tried to interpret what decisions he might have made if he were lucid. That dissonance between what should be and what was defined not only their marriage, but the fate of France. Now, let your thoughts drift gently to the candlelit halls of the Hotel St. Paul in Paris, where Isabeau once read state papers in silence as muffled voices echoed down long corridors. Picture Charles, elsewhere in the palace, cradling his head, whispering to ghosts, refusing to touch glass or wear his crown. Somewhere between them, a kingdom unravels. The marriage that began with such pomp had become a quiet tragedy, unfolding not on battlefields, but in bedchambers and throne rooms, where love could not bloom and madness could not be cured. If you've made it this far, thank you for drifting through the ruins of royal romance with us. History isn't always exciting, but sometimes, in its quiet unraveling, we find the most haunting truths. If you enjoyed this journey through doomed dynasties and shattered vows, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss another tale from the shadows of the past. Sleep well, dream deeply, and remember, sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that echo the longest. Until next time, stay curious and stay cozy.